Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for sticking with me for 6 weeks, even through that bitter cold weather that we had the first few nights, to this wonderfully beautiful spring weather we're having now. And thank you for your kind reception of Jeff's comments there. I feel that I would be welcomed back, and I appreciate that. Well, tonight we have reached the final chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. And so we are ready to go to Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Do not judge, that you may not be judged. For as you judge, so will you be judged. And the measure with which you measure will be measured out to you. Do not judge. I guess if you become a lawyer, you'd better stop there and not go on to become a judge. It obviously doesn't mean that. It also presumably would not mean do not make judgments about people. If my doorbell rings and I open it and there's some guy there selling magazines, and he says, "Hello, I'm Joe so-and-so, and you really need to have a subscription to Popular Mechanics." I don't judge. Okay. He said, "Well, that was easy. How about Maxim?" Okay. By the time he's gone, I've got subscriptions to 20 magazines. But clearly we have to make judgments in our lives, and we have to make judgments about people. You get asked out on a date. You got to decide, do I want to trust this guy or not? So it can't mean that. What does it mean? Do not judge. Now, come on, we don't want a tape with an hour and a half of silence on it. Somebody has to make a judgment here and decide what it means. Yes?
To me, it kind of seems like referring to like the Ten Commandments, or people breaking the commandments or breaking something, then you're not supposed to say how bad they are.
Ah, I gotcha. Yeah. So do not judge people when they sin.
Yeah.
Maybe don't do rash judgment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you make a judgment about someone, it would presume that you know everything about all the circumstances and what's in their mind and their background, etc. And that assumption would be only good for God. You know, only He would know all that in a person. So do not assume that you're God.
Your understanding is kind of an appendix to hers. You're still working on the idea that it has to do with judging people when they've done something wrong. And you're advising that we shouldn't do that because there's no way we can possibly know all of the circumstances and factors involved in any given person's act. You had your hand up first.
I think that we can recognize wrong. You know, we can recognize evil that's done.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what he might be saying is not to judge with arrogance. You know, not to feel superior. After you recognize the evil, you know.
Yes. You have
Don't
just
be arrogant like you're better than that.
You just reminded me of St. Augustine's saying, hate the sin but love the sinner. Kind of like that. Yeah, that's good. Yes, sir.
Well, I was thinking more like it's pointing back at who you are, and won't be judging before you judge yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think it's not just about necessarily about evil, but just about actions of people. Persons judge, what you wear and how you wear your hair, or just stuff that is just about living. And who are we to presume or why those people chose to do that? Because we all can make our own choices. So judging can be very broad.
Yeah. Criticizing. Maybe we should paraphrase. See if this is what you're saying. Maybe we could paraphrase this as: do not be judgmental. Don't have that kind of attitude throughout the day where you're kind of, like you say, criticizing and nitpicking and yeah. Yes.
I was thinking that as humans we tend to put people in classifications, like, you're a religious fanatic, or you belong to a biker gang or whatever, and if we don't want to judge people, you just look at them and you see some characteristic that maybe other people in a class have, you don't automatically assume they're a part of that class. That maybe have good connotations, may have bad connotations, but you judge them on the merits that they describe as individually of their own, and not some class that you arbitrarily assign them to.
That's good. Judgment would include prejudgment, and our word for prejudgment is prejudice, right? Prejudice. That's good.
When he follows do not judge lest you be judged, who is he saying is going to be doing that?
Oh, excellent point. We have another theological passive. What was that? The second night we talked about passive constructions, and we said, where was that? It would have been in chapter 5 of Matthew. And I don't remember where it was, but we talked about how God was the implied subject. Don't you think it's probably God here? Do not judge, lest you be judged. I mean, I suppose it could be the person you're judging. If he came in with a really weird hairdo, and I said to her, oh, good load of him, boy, is that looking strange. Being judgmental, right, as you suggest. If he overheard me, he could judge me back, I suppose. But doesn't it seem much more probable that it's God? Judge not, lest, because that's something you shouldn't be doing, God will hold you to account for it. So I think that's a good point. I'm glad you noted that. Judge not, lest you be judged. For as you judge, so will you be judged. That's passive again. Now, there we have that word as again. We dealt with that when we did the Lord's Prayer, and we saw, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and we tried to decide, does that mean to the same extent as, to the same degree as, at the same time that, in the same way that? As you judge, so will you be judged. Here, it seems to me, probably extent. To the degree that you're judgmental, you'll be judged for having done that. And the measure with which you measure will be measured out to you. There's our third passive. Once again, God, I presume. The measure with which you measure will be measured out to you. That seems to suggest a kind of an equal sign. To the degree that you are judgmental of people, to that degree, God will be judgmental of you.
Scary.
Who had a hand up?
So it's not so much in judging, but in how are you judging?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, I mean, his interest, stop judging. But the next phrase sort of tells you that if you judge in a way that is unfair or arrogant or whatever, then as you judge improperly, so will you be judged. So it's a behavioral thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Could also be, I guess, your charity, as you give to others, is that God will never be outdone in generosity. So as you, what you give out, give back to you.
This statement, the measure you give will be the measure you get, could have that reference, except in this context. The fact that it immediately follows in the same sentence, as you judge, you will be judged, suggests to me that here at least it means, to the extent you're doing something wrong, God will take note of that. But in and of itself, it could have a positive meaning. Let's take a look. Now remember last time we did chapter 6, and we pointed out at the beginning of the evening there were no correspondences to any of the material in Matthew chapter 6 in Luke's sermon. But we now hook back up with Luke's sermon here with the beginning of Matthew chapter 7. So don't lose your place. We're coming right back to Matthew. But let's all take a look at Luke chapter 6, Sermon on the Plain. And we are up to verse 37. Luke 6:37. Stop judging, and you will not be judged. Stop condemning, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and gifts will be given to you. Now notice, thus far, we've had 4 grammatical parallel constructions. You get a command, and each of those is a command, right? Mm-hmm. Stop judging. Give. Followed by what? And you will not be judged. That's a passive. Probably God again, right? It's a theological passive, as they say. Stop condemning. You will not be condemned. Forgive. You will be forgiven, because forgiving is a positive thing. Give, and gifts will be given to you. Passive again. God will give gifts to you. Matthew simply had the one initial one. Judge, and you will not be judged. Or do not judge, and you will not be judged. Which is Luke's first sentence. It seems probable to me, though of course you can't prove it, that the remaining 3 are elaborations, perhaps on Luke's part, perhaps on Jesus' part, perhaps by someone in between who passed down the tradition to Luke, of that initial one. So you've got, do not judge. What's the second one?
Do not condemn.
Stop condemning.
Yeah, do not condemn. I don't know why our translation says stop. Matthew's didn't, and I don't believe that there's a difference in the Greek here. So it's probably 2 different translators. One was assigned to do Luke, one was assigned to do Matthew, and they chose these variants, but it's not really in the Greek. Anyway, the second was do not condemn. Okay, not condemn. The third was forgive.
Forgive.
And the fourth was give. What is the difference between not judging and not condemning? Or are those simply synonyms? Is the second simply a way of restating the first?
You judge and then you condemn.
As in a law court.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way.
Right. If this were trial by judge rather than by jury, you've given up your right to a jury trial. And I've heard all the evidence for, and I've heard all the evidence against, and I make my judgment and I say, guilty. Now that's judging, but then when I give a sentence, pass a sentence on the person, that's condemning. That could be.
Well, then judging it, we talked about the fact that you have the, being judgmental is not the same as condemning at all.
Oh.
Condemning someone when you just think that, you know, why are they coming here dressed like
See, I thought you were going to say just the opposite, because I was thinking, when he came in with his weird hairdo, and I said, check out that really ugly hairdo, wasn't I condemning that person?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by condemning.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
When I think condemning, I think about the judge and the growl.
Yeah. Well, I think we tend to use the word in that context more often than anything.
Condemning seems very harsh.
Yeah. If nothing else, this seems harsher than that. To me, is that agreeable? Yeah. But since here, Matthew was talking about, we decided, having a kind of judgmental, critical-minded attitude throughout your day, throughout your life. Probably that's similar to what's being intended here, but maybe more harshly. Forgive. We all know what forgive is. Is there any relation between do not be nasty-minded and forgive people? Or is that a total non sequitur? Certainly we switch from negative to positive. Instead of do not, we have do.
It's very related, the judge and condemn are related to forgive and give, because it's like two sides, two different entire human attitudes. If you're a judgmental, condemning type person, that's very negative. But if you're forgiving and giving, you're very positive. You're more of a positive individual. So to me, it's two extremely different.
The first two are like a characterizing an overall negative attitude toward other people. And the last two are kind of characterizing an overall positive attitude. Are you closed toward other people, or are you open toward other people? Do you look for the worst in other people, or do you look for the best in other people? So if he had walked in with his weird hairdo, and instead of making a snide comment, I forgave him for his weird hair, then I would be in the second camp.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder how he did, why he did that or something.
Yes, yeah.
The forgiving is also sort of the opposite of condemning, because in order to forgive, you've already
that's right. We're still kind of in a law court metaphor scene, kind of at the edge of our comments here. That's true. Like acquittal is a form of forgiving, I guess. Yeah. Or no, it isn't actually, is it? No, forget that.
Condemning has a finality. It's like the case is closed.
Yes.
Whereas forgiveness seems more open to more, hearing more, or understanding. I want to understand this more.
Yeah. You're using the same metaphors I did, open and closed. Yeah. But I think they naturally come to mind with these attitudes. Did you want to say something? Oh, I thought you had your hand up. Yeah, okay. Now these three, granted the first two go together in contradistinction from the third, but all three of them at least have something to do with one's attitude toward other people. To give, however, means to take physical possessions of yours and give them to someone else, right? It's almost like shifting out of the topic at hand. That's why some scholars have suggested that Luke may have had a special interest in the ethics of material possessions. Because remember, Matthew had first beatitude. Poor in spirit. And Luke had?
Poor.
Poor. Right. And Luke went on to say, woe to you rich. And Luke was the one where Matthew had this bit about, if you only love those who love you, big deal. Even the hypocrites do that, or even tax collectors do that. If you greet those, only those who greet you, big deal. Even the Gentiles do that. Luke added a third one where he said, if you only lend to those from whom you hope for a return, big deal, even sinners do that. There's another instance of what would seem to be a special interest in the ethics of material possessions, and perhaps the addition of this fourth command here, because it doesn't really fit the context too well.
Well, it does if you're speaking of giving care and attention and love and that sort of giving. I guess there's more to giving than just giving, material things.
That's true. We talk about give your time, talent, and treasure. Yeah.
You can forgive someone and then you provide them with their freedom. You give them your freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can get them to love, like, that love become lovely. Instead of, like seeing somebody with a weird hairdo, instead of saying, okay, he's a weird person, you walk up to him and you introduce yourself and you say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and that's like, you totally take the other end of the thing and you reach out to people to give to them.
Yeah. I don't know whether the Greek word forgive here which is doemi, would include giving of items that are not material.
Oh, really?
I'd have to check on that. But certainly in our language it is. And even in theirs, you'd think metaphorically they could extend it to non-material possessions. Although, given the fact that there are these places where Luke seems to have inserted, because Matthew lacks them, these emphases on material possessions.
The other thing to me about all four of those words, I don't know what they are in Greek, so the judging and the condemning, there's two ways to complete word thoughts about that, where it's a law situation with a law.
Right.
But then there's the situation that has to do with prejudices.
Everyday life.
And everyday life.
Yeah.
That's totally a different context. And the same thing is true for forgive and to give. There's one thing about, say, if you forgive somebody on the job because forgiving them is going to make it easier to get the task done or whatever, if they make a mistake. But forgiving them for some other thing, in a court of law would be, and in a court of law, you don't necessarily forgive.
Yeah.
The acquittal is not a forgiveness.
Right. I think to whatever extent there's law court imagery in the background here, it's clearly not the intention of these to be referring specifically to that. It's daily life, it seems to me.
It seems to me that.
Yeah.
I think we need to read the rest of it. It says, give and gifts will be given to you, a good measure, packed together, shaken down, overflowing, will be poured into your lap.
Good, stop right there.
For the measure with which you measure can be measured out to you. In other words, what goes around comes around. That's the gist of it.
Okay.
I mean, it's not.
But remember Matthew? Matthew had, do not judge lest you be judged, for the measure you give will be the measure you get back. And all this other stuff that Luke has, condemn, forgive, give, that's all added in between. So let's compare Matthew's second statement, the measure you give will be the measure you get back, with Luke's. Measure for measure, so to speak. The measure you give will be the measure you get back. That's an equal sign. We agreed on that? Now, read yours again from Luke, and stop when I tell you to.
Okay, you want to start? Give and gifts will be given to you.
All right, yes.
Okay? A good measure, packed together, shaken down, and overflowing will be poured into your lap.
Okay, now stop. What is the implicit metaphor here?
More gifts given to you.
No, definitely more. And the literal term, what he's actually talking about, is the gifts that you will receive back. But what kind of thing is he imagining here? It's something that can be poured in your lap. Now, the verb pour is usually used for liquids, but since it's going into your lap, it's probably not a liquid. It's something that, having been poured, can be shaken together. So it's something with small, discrete bits. It's grain, don't you think? And in fact, the word for lap here in Greek is kolpos. Kolpos, you know, I mentioned before that the typical dress in first century Palestine was sandals, a loincloth, a robe, and a coat, a long coat over it with sleeves that was worn open in the front. That meant that you didn't have any pockets. So let's say that you go to market, you're a housewife, and you want to get some grain. How are you going to carry it home? They don't have plastic bags for you like we do at Kroger's. What you would do is you would pull up part of your robe, put it under your rope belt, hold it open, and the merchant will pour the grain into your kolpos. Kolpos means that pouch that you temporarily make. And then you carry your grain home, and that's how you do it. This is surely what Jesus must have in mind here, right? And he's saying, give, and gifts will be given back to you. They will be, what was the first clause there, my dear? After gifts will be given to you, comma? Good measure. Okay, so I'm assuming that's up to the top. But it doesn't stop there. The next one is packed down to make as much room as possible. Shaken together to make sure it's all settled as much so that you can add more and more and more. And even then, overflowing. Yes. So God's rewards overflow. Matthew's was an equal sign, but it seems to me Luke's is more measure will wind up more than. The extent to which you give. See, I knew that algebra would come in handy someday. It finally did. Okay. So, for the measure with, now this is the last line of Luke, for the measure with which you measure will be will in return be measured out to you. So Luke does wind up repeating what Matthew had, which is the equal sign. But, so does that mean that this part only refers to this part? It sure is looking to me like the original statement was, do not judge lest you be judged, for the measure you give will be the measure you get back. And those two make perfect sense together. And it looks to me like this, including this, is inserted in between. Because we wind up in Luke with exactly what Matthew has, but we got all this additional material as well. I mean, you could argue this is the way it originally was, and Matthew chopped out the middle. That doesn't feel right to me. I can't prove it, but it just doesn't feel right. I have a feeling Luke added these things.
We were talking about measures as if it was a good thing. Would the bad things also be returned in?
Excellent point. You've proven it, haven't you? This only goes along with this. Can you see what he said? That's an excellent point. I hadn't thought of that. Very good. Yeah, so that too would suggest this material is an expansion.
Is it possible another writer got into this loop and inserted them with the...
Well, you know, Jesus probably died and resurrected in 30. Let's do a timeline. Here's 30 AD, Jesus dies and resurrects. Luke didn't write his gospel until probably about 90. So he probably wasn't alive when Jesus was alive. He was born after Jesus' death and resurrection. So somebody or some bodies will have had to have transmitted Jesus' sayings down to Luke. And so it's always possible that there could have been some change in transmission along the way. Somebody in between Jesus and Luke may have decided to add these things. Although once again, excuse me, because we can see this interest in material possessions elsewhere in Luke, I have a suspicion this is Luke, since he added the poor and the rich and all that stuff. Yeah. Okay. Now, speaking of this question of transmission, this is a very good place for us to consider something. Let me have a couple of readers. You've got a weird hairdo. How about you? Would you mind? And I need another. How about you, sir? Would you mind?
Sure.
Now, you're going to be Matthew. Would you go back to Matthew? And we're right at the bit about, right after the measure. What verse is that?
Verse 3 coming up. Why do you know?
3, exactly. And you will stay at Luke, and you're ready for, what is it, 39. Are you sure?
In my Bible.
Probably 41.
I want the parable. Is that 39?
39.
Yeah, okay, good. Then we're right. Now, what I'd like you to do, Matthew, is read up to a punctuation mark, like a comma, and stop, and we'll let Luke read up to that equivalent. Because I want us to compare how close are these two versions of this parable coming up in wording. So, Matthew, go for it.
Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye?
Comma, stop.
Can a blind person guide?
Nope, got to go back earlier.
And he told them a parable?
Yep, that's it.
Can a blind person guide a blind person?
No, wait a minute, that's not it.
I think it's 41.
Is it 41? That's what we want. Yes, you're right. Sorry.
Obviously, I wasn't there.
No, it's my fault. Yeah, go ahead.
Why? Go ahead. But do not perceive...
No, wait a minute. We never heard his. Let's start over, shall we? Matthew.
Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye?
Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye?
But do not perceive the wooden beam in your own eye.
But do not perceive the wooden beam in your own.
How can you say to your brother,
How can you say to your brother,
let me remove that splinter from your eye,
Brother, let me remove the splinter in your eye,
while the wooden beam is in your eye.
when you do not even notice the wooden beam in your own eye.
You hypocrite,
You hypocrite,
remove the wooden beam from your eye first.
remove the wooden beam from your eye first,
Then you will see clearly to remove the splinter from your brother's eye.
then you will see clearly to remove the splinter in your brother's eye.
Echo.
Yeah. It's extremely close, isn't it? There was that one spot where it took about twice as many words to say the 5 words that you said. I think it was the brother line, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Matthew, what did you have there for brother? Brother, let me take out the splinter.
How can you say to your brother, let me remove the splinter from your eye?
And you had?
How can you say to your brother, brother, let me remove the splinter in your eye?
Yeah, so it's a little bit, but if we had to give a percentage to it, 90% identical? 95? Darn close. Now, this is of interest concerning this question that was just raised about the transmission of Jesus' sayings between, assuming that Jesus had a 3-year ministry, which most people assume, from 27 to 30, he said his sayings, they would have got transmitted over the decades, and then Luke writes them down. Of course, Mark probably wrote 65 to 70, and Matthew wrote about 85. They too incorporated Jesus' sayings. And John seems to have written maybe during the 90s. But at any rate, there had to have been transmission. The question becomes, was this transmission oral or written? Were Jesus' sayings written down prior to their arrival at the ears of the evangelists, or was it simply Peter came home one night and said to Mrs. Peter, wow, I heard the most fantastic things today, measure you give, and so on. And then the next day, over the clothesline and back, she says to her neighbor, you know what my husband said last night? And gets transmitted, she tells her husband, it goes around.
That's like that game.
Excuse me?
That's like that game you play.
Oh, I used to call it telephone. Did you call it telephone?
Yeah,
So I've heard it called telegraph.
You whisper, it goes out.
Let's try that. What the heck? That's a good one. That's good. I will say something to her, and she'll pass it on. We'll stop with you. Let's see, what shall I say?
I'm all ears.
Oh, yes.
My children like to eat pizza with anchovies and jalapeno peppers.
All right, now what did you hear her say?
His children like to eat pizza with anchovies and peppers.
That's pretty close.
I got the jalapeno
I got the
peppers. I
jalapeno.
did.
I got the
Jalapenos missing.
Did I say that?
Jalapeno dropped out. Yeah.
Did I not say jalapeno?
Now, if a single sentence can lose one word in 60 seconds, imagine what would happen to this saying over decades. Now, you can argue, I'll bet this is what you're going to say. You can argue that people had better memories back then because they didn't rely on writing. Am I right?
No,
Oh, okay.
Question. I was listening to a tape that we got out front, and it was on the book of Mark, and it said that Matthew and John was taking a lot from the book of Mark and Could this be something,
You mean Matthew and Luke?
Matthew and Luke?
Right.
That Matthew and Luke were taken a lot from the book of Mark. Could this be something that was omitted when they wrote the book of Mark, that he had written in there, since he wrote?
Now that's very interesting. I believe that that scholar is correct, whomever you're citing. Mark was a source for a lot of stuff that is in Matthew and that is in Luke. How do we know that it wasn't just all three of them getting it independently? Why should we assume that Matthew and Luke actually had copies of Mark in front of them as they wrote their Gospels? Because the wording is identical, or close to identical, just like the speck and log passage that we looked at. Traditions about Jesus in those three Gospels are sometimes, not always, but sometimes almost verbatim. And that cannot be explained if it's all just oral passing on. So that's why scholars have concluded that Matthew and Luke used Mark. But there's a problem. The problem is that there are other verbatim passages that are not in Mark. In fact, none of the Sermon on the Mount and none of the Sermon on the Plain is in Mark. These sayings that we've been spending the last 6 weeks on are only found in Matthew and Luke.
Maybe Mark wrote what he wanted to write.
It could be, although I cannot believe,
What was important to him.
I cannot believe that if Mark had knowledge of the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, judge not, that he wouldn't have included that. And he doesn't have it.
But he was first.
But he was first. So, there must have been some other source from whence Matthew and Luke got these materials, like the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, that don't show up in Mark or John. This other source we refer to as Q. You've probably heard of Q. Q is from the German word Quelle. QU is pronounced like KV in German. Quelle is simply the word for source. So the German scholars who first deduced that Matthew and Luke must have had some source other than Mark in common simply called it source. And then later on, being lazy, Scripture scholars reduced it down to just Q. That's where the word comes from. Now, how do they know that Q was a written document the way Matthew is? Why not just presume that various sayings of Jesus wound up being heard by Matthew and wound up being heard by Luke, and they just, for some reason, never wound up being heard by Mark? Exactly. Even the Q material, oops, I got to do it this way, there we go. Even the Q material has verbatim passages. And that argues that there must have existed some collection of Jesus' sayings that pre-existed both Matthew and Luke. So, when would it have come into existence? Well, it cannot have existed before Jesus made his sayings. So it's got to be after 30. It obviously was in existence by 85 because Matthew uses Q as a source. On the other hand, it was not in existence so early that it would have reached Mark as well. So what the heck, let's just go with 50 as a nice round number. And we'll say somewhere around then, somebody made a collection of Jesus' sayings. We think it was just sayings that were collected rather than a full gospel. because there are no narratives common to Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark and John. All of the passages that Matthew and Luke have, and only they have, are sayings. And there's almost 200 verses of Jesus' sayings that show up in Matthew and Luke, do not show up in Mark and John. We think those come from this Q source. We no longer have a copy of Q. Well, actually, on my trip to Israel several years ago, I came across a copy. I'm keeping it in my desk drawer for let the price inflate a bit.
Who was it that said that many stories were?
Oh yes,
John.
Exactly. The last saying in John.
Yeah.
That's a good one. I'm glad you brought that up.
And he has footnote CQ.
Isn't that a magazine? CQ? No, that's GQ. Right. There are also, last verse in John, there are also many other things that Jesus did, but if these were to be described individually, I do not think the whole world would contain the books that would be written. In addition to material in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that's found in all three, and in addition to material in Matthew and Luke that's not found in Mark, there are also some passages that are only in Matthew. For example, laborers in the vineyard. A guy hires day laborers at 6 a.m., 9 a.m., noon, 5, and 7, and then gives them all the same wage. The early ones are outraged, and the landowner says, I'm free to do what I want with my money. There are also passages in Luke that are in no other gospel, nowhere else in the Bible. For example, prodigal son, good shepherd. Excuse me, not good shepherd, good Samaritan. Can you imagine if Luke had not written his gospel, we would never know about the prodigal son? We would never know that great story about the good Samaritan. And of course, as John has just reminded us, who knows what other great things he said that didn't wind up down in
Who knows
what we have, right? When I die, presuming I go to heaven, one of the first things I'm going to ask Jesus is, tell me what didn't get recorded here. I want to hear all the good stuff.
And he's going to give you this huge book.
Right. A book the whole world could contain, yeah. All right, well, let's return now. Before we leave Luke, you started to read a couple of sentences that show up. Here's Matthew. He's got the judge not, measure you give, and that's immediately followed by speck and log parable. Luke has judge not, measure you give, with all this extra expansion that we looked at, followed by speck and log, but he's also got two sentences that he inserts here between those two. And you started to read those, and I stopped you. He also told them a parable. This is verse 39.
And he told them a parable, can a blind person guide a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? No disciple is superior to the teacher, but when fully trained, every disciple will be like his teacher.
What is the connection between that and what precedes and follows it? Judge not, measure you give, speck and log. Why do we have this thing here about blind leading the blind? I can see it, it just occurred to me. I can see a connection with speck and log, because I'm the guy with lots of sins, and I presume to correct her when I see this little sin. So now that is me teaching her. So that fits with the teacher, and that fits with the blind leading the blind. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
You had said last week that sight can be, or light can be linked sometimes to goodness and sometimes to enlightenment. Could this thing in the eye have to do with you're not enlightened and therefore you're blind? Something to that effect?
And that's very good. And also, even more specifically perhaps, you're not enlightened as to your own sinfulness. Because, I mean, stop and think about it. Well, I mean, try to actually visualize what Jesus says in that parable. She has a speck in her eye. Have you ever had a little piece of something get in your eye? And they recommended in Boy Scouts that you put a wooden matchstick and flip the eyelid over and try to get it out carefully. Why, imagine that's her situation, and here am I. What do I have in my eye? A beam, a log. Here I come clumping up to her. Oh, let me take that out of your eye. I mean, that's absurd. This is one of those places where I'm convinced it shows how Jesus had a sense of humor. We never think of him as smiling or laughing, but I think he did. I think certainly those around him would have laughed. Okay, having dealt with those, we're ready to go back to Matthew and pick up where we left off. What verse are we up to? 6? Okay. Do not give what is holy to dogs, or throw your pearls before swine, lest they trample them underfoot and turn and tear you to pieces. Anybody care to tell us what that means? Sure, that's a great idea. Specialists have provided us with these footnotes. We ought to look and see what they have to say. 7:6. Dogs and swine were Jewish terms of contempt for Gentiles. This saying may originally have derived from a Jewish Christian community opposed to preaching the gospel, what is holy or pearls, to Gentiles. Ha-ha, you see what they're doing here? They're doing the same suggestion that I made about not a letter, not the least letter of the Mosaic Law will stop being in force. Remember I suggested maybe that's not Jesus who said that, but a Jewish Christian? They're doing the same thing here with this one. Anyway, lost my place here. Here we are. In the light of 28:19, that can hardly be Matthew's meaning. 28:19 is the next to the last verse in Matthew's Gospel. It says, "Go unto all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." Obviously, a Gentile mission. So, he may have taken the saying as applying to a Christian dealing with an obstinately impenitent fellow Christian. Okay, well, since not even the editors seem to know what that meant, let's go on to the next one. We are running short on time. That's why I'm passing over it. Okay. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. This pattern seems to be something Jesus kind of liked. He gives a command, and then he gives a little "and" statement afterward. You know, like judge, and you will not be judged. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. So ask, seek, knock. That then would seem to be about prayer. Would we agree? We're talking about God here. Oh, hey, these are passives again, aren't they? The door will be opened by God for you, yeah. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which one of you would hand his son a stone when he asks for a loaf of bread, or a snake when he asks for a fish? If you then, who are wicked, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good things to those who ask him? There's that father-children image again at the end of the 6 antitheses. Love your enemies so that you will be children of your Father. Remember that? I once read Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. It took me an entire summer. Every morning at 6:30, my alarm went off. I went out on the front porch with a cup of coffee, and I determinedly read War and Peace for 30 minutes. And by the end of the summer, I'd reached the 1100th page. Somewhere in there, there's a Russian peasant who is in prison, and his cellmate is Prince Andrei, who's a aristocratic bourgeois person. Anyway, Prince Andrei overheard the peasant say his prayer before sleep. The peasant lay down and said, "Father, lay me down like a stone, raise me up like a loaf." And the peasant was instantly asleep and got up refreshed the next morning. Prince Andrei, being full of political ambition, had insomnia all night. Anyway, that prayer definitely comes from this passage. Which of you would hand his son a stone when he asks for a loaf of bread? Rhetorical question, answer, none of you. If that's true for you who are evil, how much more will God give if you but ask? He's ready and willing to do so. Then we get the golden rule. We mentioned before that the golden rule appeared earlier in Luke's version. It was back there in the non-retaliation, love of enemies area. For some reason, it's been delayed to here in Matthew. Matthew also has an addition to it. Luke simply said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Matthew has that, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," but then he adds, "This is the law and the prophets." We've already seen law and prophets was the way to say Old Testament back then. The whole Old Testament can be fulfilled if you just do this one thing. Jesus, you'll recall, was approached by someone and asked which was the greatest commandment. Jesus did not cite the golden rule. He cited what Jews called the Shema, from the word listen. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 says, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind and your strength." Jesus' version adds soul, heart, mind, soul, strength. I think it's Deuteronomy 6:5. Check on that, would you? Because I don't want to misinform. But then Jesus, without having been asked by the guy for what were the two biggest laws, goes ahead and gives another, which is do unto others. The second is like unto the first. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When you think about it, the 10 Commandments start off with commandments that have to do with our relationship with God. For example, what's the first one? You shall have no other gods before me. What's the second one? Do not take God's name in vain. No graven images. Keep holy the Sabbath. These have to do with our relationship with God, but then it's followed with 6 commandments that have to do with our relationship with our neighbors. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not covet, etc. So really, for Jesus to have plucked out these 2 commandments, Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18, the golden rule, was in effect to summarize the Ten Commandments. Love God mightily as you can, and love your neighbor as yourself.
That's right.
Was that correct? Okay, good, thanks. Verse 13 of Matthew. Luke has none of these passages we just looked at in his sermon, so we're not flipping over to him yet. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction. And those who enter through it are many. How narrow the gate and constricted the road that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Fairly self-explanatory. With 12 minutes left, I'm going to go on. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but underneath are ravenous wolves. By their fruits you will know them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Just so, every good tree bears good fruit, and a rotten tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a rotten tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. So by their fruits you will know them. Let me just read Matthew's version of this passage. It's Matthew chapter 6, verse 43 to 45. Excuse me, Luke. Thank you. Thank you. A good tree does not bear rotten fruit, nor does a rotten tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its fruit. For people do not pick figs from thorn bushes, nor do they gather grapes from brambles. A good person out of the store of goodness in his heart produces good, but an evil person out of the store of evil produces evil. For from the fullness of the heart the mouth speaks. I don't like that translation. The Greek word there is treasure of the heart. I like the more literal translation of the Greek. Out of the treasure of the heart, the mouth speaks. But anyway, these are pretty darn close, don't you think? But Matthew has an intro and a conclusion that are missing in Luke. He starts off with, beware false prophets, for they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inside they are wolves. That's not in Luke. And that gives a very definite application to the tree and fruit. It applies to false prophets specifically. In Luke, it applies to anybody who's good or bad. We would all agree, right, that good tree is good person, bad tree is bad person, good fruits are good deeds, bad fruits are bad deeds. Yes, sir?
You just hit on what I was going to say. I think Luke, what you just read, Luke, he had person, whereas in Matthew he has tree. And,
well, I didn't mention Matthew's peculiar conclusion, which is any tree that does not bear fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. Matthew, throughout his gospel, has a penchant for mentioning hell. That you don't, and if you look at the same spot in Mark or Luke, they tend not to have those references. So that seems to have been a special interest of Matthew's. I suspect Matthew added that line. On the other hand, as you say, Luke has a concluding line that is not in Matthew. And that's this bit about the mouth, right? For out of the goodness of the heart, the good person speaks. Out of the evil, the bad person speaks. For out of the treasure of the heart, the mouth speaks. All right.
So by their fruits you will know them. You don't think that's sort of the same?
Well, but Luke had that also. 44, for every tree is known by its own fruit. Yeah. The reference to mouth is what's peculiar to Luke.
What's in this Bible about the mouth?
Sure. Real loud, please.
Okay. A good man produces goodness from the good of his heart. An evil man produces evil out of his store of evil. Each man speaks from his heart's abundance.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not drive out demons in your name? Did we not do mighty deeds in your name? Then I will declare to them solemnly, I never knew you. Depart from me, you evildoers.
Out of my sight.
Notice in verse 22, many will say to me on that day. What day is that? Judgment Day. Yes. Luke does not have any of this. 21 to 23 in Matthew. But if you go to Matthew chapter 25, which you don't need to, but I just want to read it real quick, you have this. Matthew 25:31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and the angels with him, he will sit upon his glorious throne, and all the nations will be assembled before him. And he will separate them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you. Skipping down. Then he will say, 41, then he will say to those on his left, Depart from me, you evildoers, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. There's Matthew talking about hell again. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. A stranger, and you gave me no welcome. Naked, and you gave me no clothing. In prison, and you did not visit me. Ill, and you did not care for me. Then they will answer and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or ill or in prison and not minister to your needs? It seems to me that what we have here in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 to 23 is like a miniature version of that last judgment scene from Matthew 25. You guys see the similarity? Okay. All of that is missing in Luke. That brings us to the final passage in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 7:24. Everyone who listens to these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and buffeted the house, but it did not collapse. It had been set solidly on rock. And everyone who listens to these words of mine but does not act on them will be like a fool who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and buffeted the house, and it collapsed and was completely ruined. So we have a comparison here of two houses. Matthew says a guy built his house on, a wise man built his house on rock, and then you have 3 bits of meteorological data. The first of which is the winds blew.
Rain fell.
The what? Rain, that's right. Rain, wind. Oh, and then flood in between wind?
Yeah.
Rain,
floods, and then winds.
Got it. And then, great was the fall of it. The foolish man, by the way, don't you think... Oh, you're right. Great was the non-fall of it. It stood. It withstood. Don't you think that the, what would you call it? Fairy tale? The 3 little pigs comes from this? Yeah.
It does.
Now, the foolish guy built his house on sand, and then you get the same 3 meteorological data again, am I right? rain, floods, wind, and great was the fall of it. Okay, let's compare Luke's version. You, sir? Could you look at Luke? It should be like 47, maybe? What is it?
It actually starts at 47.
Starts at 47, okay. Well, she's already got it. Let's go ahead and let her. Very loudly, please.
I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, listens to my words, and acts on them.
All right, now wait. It doesn't say wise the way Matthew did, but clearly this is a person who's going to abide by Jesus' sayings again. So I'll say a person here. I'll say a hearer. Good, go ahead.
That one is like a person building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock.
Oh, now that's different. Here you simply build on rock. Presumably the rock is on the surface. Here you dig down and you do a foundation and then you put it on rock. Okay, go ahead.
When the flood came, the river burst against that house, but could not shake it because it had been well built.
Okay, just one flood, not floods, and it's a river that's in spate. And it stood. All right, second half.
But the one who listens and does not act is like a person.
Oh, wait a minute. I put hearer here, but it's not just hearer, is it? Hearer and doer. Hear and do. And here you've got hear and not do. That's the difference. Okay, I'm sorry, please.
And does not act is like a person who built a house on the ground without a foundation.
Okay. On the ground, no foundation.
When the river burst against it, it collapsed at once and was completely destroyed.
Good. What are the principal differences between the Matthean and the Lucan versions of the parable of the two houses? Well, for one thing, you got specification of wise and foolish. In Matthew, you don't have that in Luke.
In Luke, you've got it more specific. A hearer who does. Here, wise and foolish could have all sorts of connotations.
Did Matthew not have that?
I don't think so.
Oh, actually he does. Everyone who listens to these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man.
Okay, yeah,
So it's,
I was just concentrating on what you wrote up there.
yeah, right. Okay. A second obvious difference. Rock and sand for Matthew versus dig deep, build a foundation that is on rock, subterranean rock, versus build on the surface with no foundation. So the primary difference seems to be with or without foundation. The rock seems kind of secondary since it's only mentioned here and not over here. Third major difference, the meteorological phenomena. Here you've got rain, floods, wind. Here you've got a river in flood that overflows its banks. How can we account for these differences? Scholars think that probably what Matthew has in mind, here is the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And therefore, here's the Holy Land. There's a ridge of mountains that goes down the Holy Land, kind of like a spine.
The map right here. The map, you're right.
Yeah, that'll do. The mountains go down the center in between the coast and this depression, which is why you've got the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. There are, I guess you'd call them gullies, or I might call them gullies, since I'm from Kansas. That's what we call them up there, that have formed in between the mountains. Palestine only has 2 seasons, a dry season and a wet season. We've got 4, spring, summer, fall, winter. They've got 2. So for 6 months of the year, these gullies are dry. For 6 months of the year, they're wet. I think what Matthew has in mind is during the dry season, a foolish man wants to build his house. He sees that this sandy soil in the gully is nice and smooth. He doesn't have to take away any vegetation or anything. Here's a nice big rock in the middle of the gully. He builds his house on that. Why is that foolish? Because, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Houstonian. It's a floodplain. Because in the wet season, moisture collects from the Mediterranean Sea, comes over, hits those mountains, dumps all of its rainwater, and all of these gullies flood. So any house built there, even on a rock, is going to be washed away. That's why it would be foolish. The wise man, however, builds over here. Right, not in a gully. So it would seem that Matthew has a Palestinian environment in mind, where in the ancient Mediterranean basin could you find people who built foundations? Nobody in Palestine built foundations. The Greeks and the Romans built foundations. And they dug down to sink those foundations. If you went to Greece, you'd see that. If you went to Italy, you'd see that. So Luke's version seems to have a Greco-Roman background in mind. Consequently, which of the two do you think is probably closer to what Jesus originally said? The Matthean version. Exactly. This is one of the criteria that scholars use. There's about a dozen criteria that scholars use to try and determine which versions of sayings that have come down to us is closer to the original. And that's what the Q scholars do. That's what scholars on any given gospel do. We've reached the end, but I want to point out that those last 2 passages, not just the parable of the 2 houses, but right before it, for example, Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who hears me and does what I say. Luke has exactly that. Do not call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you. Followed by this comparison. Those who hear and do, and those who do not hear and do. So it seems to me this is a perfect way to end the sermon. For 3 chapters now, Jesus has been telling you what to do. And right here at the end he says, don't just listen to what I say. Now go do it. And isn't that a very nice counterbalance to the Beatitudes with which the sermon began? And with that I conclude.
Thank you.
Thank you all.